should be good.
All right. So we are going to we're gonna continue talking about assessments today. I want to go over a little bit more stuff that we went over on Monday, and I just want to jump in a little bit more with this just because we kind of briefly touched on a lot of this stuff, and we really want to cover it a little bit more in depth, and we wanted to break it up a little bit more so we could have enough content to talk about on both Monday and today and have a good time for questions. So again, just as a recap from Monday, the Hawthorne effect is a really important thing to consider with any sort of training program where we're looking at creating and facilitating behavioral change with a client, right? If we're looking at facilitating behavioral change with a client, we can use this to our advantage because like it says there, all we're going to see and all we're going to get is we're going to get the alteration of behavior by the people who are being observed because they're being watched, right? It's just like the example that I talked about the other day where if you're driving on the highway, cop pulls up behind you or pulls up onto the highway, you slow down immediately, even if you're going under the speed limit, just because you are now being watched, you're going to be extra careful and you're going to follow everything that you're doing a little bit more so. So we can use this to our advantage very, very, very well by just setting rules for our clients and making sure that they are adherent to those rules, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to those same ones. The example that I gave for a client of mine on Monday was that I have a client who's trying to lose a significant amount of weight. And what we do is I make him take a picture of every single meal. And if he doesn't send me a picture of any meals that day, I text him at the end of the day and I'm just like, oh, cool. Guess we fasted today. And I give him a little shit about it. And then he responds back and he sends me like a diary list of what he ate because he's like, I just didn't have time to take pictures, but I took notes. I have everything down. And what we've done with this is or what's happened with this is because all I do is I send like a little 5-second update to him, which is just asking for this. Like he's gone from eating mostly carbs and fats to eating like protein, vegetables, and carbs, and like having a much more balanced plate, much better meal composition, and he's losing weight because of it. Like in all of his blood panels and everything that he gets checked out at the doctor are moving in the right direction simply because I'm watching him do something, right? And this is I think it's a very underutilized thing when it comes to even remote coaching, because if you're looking at remote coaching and like training remote clients, your spreadsheet or your training app or whatever it is that you're using is your version of the Hawthorne effect. It's how you monitor athletes, how you monitor progress, and how you monitor everything that they're going to do. So if you have people who are doing nutrition, if you have people that are doing, that are training, and people aren't entering any data or anything at all into their sheets, it's going to be a lot harder for you to do so. But you also have the opportunity to give them, to hold and try to keep them accountable to it, right? Because if they're not doing anything and they're not doing any of the things that they're supposed to be doing, like Pasquale doesn't, where you put any of the information into the sheet, I can hold him a little bit more accountable and be like, yo, you said you wanted to cut the other day because you're feeling a little fat for yourself, but you're not entering any data into the sheet, so I can't help you with this at all. I don't know where you are.
I think Matt's projecting that onto you, Pasquale.
I have texts. I have the proof.
Okay.
I have the proof. I have text messages. I'll share them all in the Slack channel. But I am also projecting a little bit because I took a video myself today. It was atrocious. But it's one of those things that we can use to our advantage, because if we see that people aren't entering information, we have to start holding our clients a little bit more accountable to doing the stuff that they've put forth so that we can hold them accountable to their goals, right? When we're looking at talking about goals and assessments, if somebody has a goal, remember that they are also paying you for motivation. So they are also keeping you to keep them accountable, or paying you to keep them accountable to the goal, right? Just because they do not have the ability to do it on their own. They aren't very well self-directed. So they need your help to keep them accountable to what's going on. So it's your job as a coach to help keep them accountable. And if you're not doing things like sending out weekly check-in emails or bugging people when they're not entering data into sheets or doing whatever it is, your attrition is probably going to be a little bit higher because you're not spending the time to build a coach to client relationship that you should be building. Right. And again, this is one of those things where if we look at the DISC and how people communicate based off the DISC, you can tailor your communication directly to that person, right? Like for example, I'm gonna use Pasquale and Sam as examples of clients because they're both they're both clients of mine and they both communicate very differently, right? Whereas like with Pasquale, I can be very direct and blunt and be like, "Yo,
Great.
stop like
Well, whatever you
wasting my
have is
time and
wrong
enter
because
stuff."
I can't log in.
I can be like, stop wasting time, like stop wasting your own time and entering stuff and like enter your data so I can make your program better. And with Sam, because Sam is a delicate little flower, I have to be much more supportive and kind with him and be like, hi, Sam, hope everything's okay. Hope all is well with you. I noticed you haven't entered your data into your sheet. I'd really appreciate it if you were to start entering, right? So just basing things off of the communication that you have with your clients, off of their individual disc profile, which we give all in the case study. It gives you all of the examples of everybody and how people are going to communicate. It'll make your life a lot easier because you can communicate more effectively with that person to kind of facilitate the results that you're looking for and keep them a little bit more accountable, right? And again, with this, it's kind of like we talked about here. If you're going into the assessment in general, all of their the disc considerations are also going to impact the person's autonomics, right? So if we're looking at somebody who is, it's like the example that Kyle gave the other day, if somebody's a little bit more extroverted,
With
it's
your
going to be
information.
a lot harder to get them to do like resting heart rate and blood pressure if we are in a smaller like locked room where they don't feel as comfortable, right? One of the trainers that I used to work with at my club down here used to start every single assessment by bringing people into the assessment office and locking the door. And that was like step one. Was like, you need to stop. Like, you need to stop doing that right now. Start doing the assessments out on the floor. Don't lock the door anymore. Exactly. It's like the panic room. It's like people walk in there like, bad things are about to happen to me. I can't do this anymore. So we have to understand the people that we're looking at, but like for that particular coach and trainer, that worked for them because that was how, like, they were a little bit more introverted, and they were people that got very nervous and didn't know what to do when other people would walk into the room, right? Like if another trainer would walk into the room because they didn't know there was an assessment going on, like they would get that would give them a tremendous amount of anxiety, and they wouldn't know how to handle that situation. So they would prevent that from happening by locking the door. And when we had a conversation about it, and I started to understand why, it made a little bit more sense why they're doing so. But it's just one of those things that we got to look at, not your own comfortability level, but we have to look at the client first, because this is all about building relationships with the clients and establishing trust right off the bat. When we're doing movement assessments, we want to make sure that everything is going to be directly applicable to a particular person's goal, because if it's not applicable to a client's goal, there's absolutely no point in doing so, right? If you've got somebody who like just wants to look at like losing 30 or 40 pounds, I don't need to take passive hip internal rotation measurements. I probably don't really need to take that. I can be pretty sure that we can do better assessments for that particular person, like circumference measurements or aerobic assessments or things like that. That'll just be a little bit more relatable to that person's specific goal, right? Because again, with that person, particularly if they've got a very low training age, a lot of the things and a lot of the compensations that you're probably going to see with that person are going to be weight related anyway. And as soon as they start losing weight, those are going to clear up, right? It's like we talked about the other day. If you get somebody who's significantly overweight, like, of course, they're going to be in a little bit more of an extended posture with an anterior pelvic tilt and a flatter back and more forward projected rib cage, because they're constantly front loaded. So if we get them to lose 30 pounds, 40 pounds, you might fix all of that stuff without even having to touch any of that stuff. And you can provide a lot better training experience because it's more directed to the person's specific goal and not based off of an arbitrary system that may not be relevant or applicable to that client's goals. Right. And I think that's a really important thing that we always try to drive home in any of the stuff that we're going through, is like, when I'm looking at my clients, when I'm taking clients on for remote training, the assessments that we do are going to be exactly what they want to do and what they're coming to me for. Like if they're looking at getting out of getting out of pain to get back to performance, this is where we're going to do a lot of passive assessments. I'm going to look at passive movement, look at the ISA, look at shoulder internal and external rotation and things like that. If they are coming for more performance stuff, I'm looking at trying to see what they're trying to perform at. right, and perform well with. If I'm looking at this, if I have somebody who wants to come in and do pull-ups, and I never watch them try to do a pull-up, or somebody wants to take their 1 rep max back squat from 315 to 405, and I never watch them back squat, I am not going to be able to provide a sufficient program for them to get them to their particular goal, because I've never actually seen how they do anything that requires work or requires actual stimulus, right? So for performance goals, we want to always assess the thing that they want, the task at hand that they want to perform at. So you also get to set a baseline and see how they're going to do moving forward. And again, this doesn't mean that if I'm looking to increase somebody's squat, like I said, with from like 315 to 405, I'm not looking at making them do a 1 rep max. I'm looking at making them do like a moderately heavy set of 5. So I can see kind of how they're going to compensate under heavier load and what we can do to build up a better training program and choose better exercises, not better correctives, to get them to where we want to go. And that's my biggest thing that I want to do with the assessments is the assessments that we always use. Everything that we do in an assessment is designed to give people better exercise selection, not necessarily better warm-ups. The warm-ups are the secondary and tertiary things that we're looking at here. Exercise selection and volume management are the number one thing that we're looking at. So if we're programming out for somebody based off of their assessment, position and force vector is the number one thing that we're going to look at, because I can change a lot of how somebody's going to perform or express movement capacity by just changing the force vector and the position of the exercise, right? Like for example, if I've got somebody who's looking to like put on a lot more weight in a squat and they hinge really far forward, we might end up doing a lot more heels elevated high bar squats or front squats or high handle safety bar squats, where they get to do a lot more things with the load in front of them, so that they get to work on a more vertical torso and more anterior knee translation, so we can build up more tissue in the quads so that they may end up having a stronger squat down the line when we start reintroducing competition specific movements. I'm not going to sit there and have them do a bunch of like R&T banded squats around the shoulders to keep them vertical, because there's not enough stimulus in that position to actually create any form of structural or tangible change.
I think piggybacking on that, when you guys look at assessments, the biggest thing that we're typically looking at are like compensatory strategies, right? And the biggest thing that I just can't reiterate enough with this is compensatory strategies are caused by a lack of preparedness for a movement or an environment, right? That can be training age, that can be load, intensity, volume, fatigue management, that can be novelty of an exercise, that can be a lot of different things, right? So when you see somebody with a hingy body weight squat, right? Like Matt said, we can use a lot of constraints to put somebody in a position where they can get more vertical. But one of the things that I'll usually tell people, like when they tell me they can't squat to depth or they can't get more knee flexion on a squat, right, is I'm going to lay them on their back and tell them to just pull their knees to their chest, right? And at that point, we know you have passive range of motion. You have the ability to get in a full depth squat. You don't have the strength and stability to get in a full depth squat against gravity, right? Like that's what that tells me. So at that point, a full depth squat is not harmful to you. We just have to figure out how to put you in a position to get there, right? How to prepare you for that. And like Matt said, it might be tissue tolerance. It might be loading scheme. It might be a lot of different things. It might be different constraints that allow for a better range of motion. But you also have to understand that you might see compensatory strategies in a singular set as people fatigue, right? Like you guys have all done, I'm sure, like a set of squats or deadlifts for like 10 reps. Rep 10 probably does not look like reps 1 and 2, right? Is that even a bad thing? Is the big question. Or is that actually just giving you more variability within that movement paradigm and building resiliency within that paradigm, right? So what's the level of compensation? How do we measure that, right? Again, is it a compensatory strategy because you're not ready for the movement, Or did you just program the incorrect amount of volume and intensity? Right? When I see compensatory strategies, it's almost always trainer error, not client ability level. Like you pick the wrong exercise, the wrong load, or the wrong volume. Maybe it's the wrong microcycle setup, right? It might be a total volume. It might be how sessions build on top of one another. It could be a lot of things. But when I look at that, like I'm not going to hold that against the client and start detraining them and taking fitness away. I'm going to look at my programming and exercise selection, my use of constraints. Myself as a trainer, I'm going to take that on myself as something that I should have been able to correct for based on the assessments that I started with, right? And what they told me. And like Matt said, like the goal is not better prep exercises, it's better exercises, right? Better programming at that point.
Yeah, this is one of those things where like I kind of said it a little bit on Mondays. Like we got kind of known as the warm up group, and like the warm up guys and the prep guys. And like one of the things that we've really tried to make a really strong push to be known for now is that we're known for the exercise selection that we choose. And one of the things that I think a lot of people end up missing out on, and this is something that we've seen a lot of people do in training or in fitness in general, is they believe that the term variability equals breathing stuff, where it's like that's just one small component of it. But what we're training when we're looking at variability stuff is we're looking at things that are not within your norms, right? So not within the normal things that you normally do. For example, like on my post yesterday about when I was benching and like doing warm-ups for my bench, like I'm doing a hook lying alternating kettlebell floor press with 105-pound kettlebells in each hand, because that's training the shortened position of a pec. Because then when I go to bench, I have a lot of retraction and depression and a slightly wider grip. So I'm consistently training the lengthened portion of a pec, right? So my variability training, the output has to be significantly higher because I want to actually train and try to actually outdo the compensation that I'm developing, or just train both ends of the spectrum, right? So we're looking at trying to figure out what we can do where we can build more resiliency, and building more resiliency is always going to happen with load. Building more resiliency is not going to happen with nothing, with like no stimulus whatsoever, right? We're not going to build more resilient athletes, more resilient humans or clients if we detrain and deload every single thing that they're looking at doing.
And also, if you show a compensatory strategy under a heavy load and you just cut the load in half and the strategy goes away, the compensation goes away, did you actually solve the problem, or did you just make the exercise lighter? You just decrease the stimulus, right? Like that's not a fix. You didn't fix, quote unquote, that strategy at all. You just made the exercise easier. That's not a problem. That's not problem solving. That's problem avoidance.
Right.
Right. Like those are two very separate things. One of them is detraining somebody and one of them is continuing to train somebody. Right. So again, like in that example, like Matt said, somebody has a really hingy back squat. Well, we can still do heavy front loaded squats. We can still do hack squats or leg presses that we can load tissues and start getting physiological and physical adaptations that will actually go on to improve whatever factor or whatever variance that we're trying to improve, right? Just simply cutting somebody's load and putting them on the ground in no way fixes a compensatory strategy, right? Like that's, you changed the stimulus, right? So if we want to actually apply a quote unquote corrective, the stimulus for the corrective has to be stronger than the stimulus that creates the adaptation or the compensatory strategy itself, or it's never going to get fixed.
And exactly the example that I gave when I was doing the kettlebell floor press the other day, like I do normal dumbbell presses with like hundreds, and now I'm doing the floor press with heavier kettlebells than I do with dumbbells, because I've got more constraints, I've got more contact with the ground, and it's a little bit more stable and easier of a pattern for me to load heavily. So I have to work harder to do that because I'm working into a different compensation or a different pattern. But again, I'm trying to work on something that may be holding me back down the line. And again, one other thing I'd like to reiterate and say, and like just make very, very clear and well and known, is that compensations are not necessarily a bad thing unless they're detracting from performance. Right? Like if I'm a power lifter doing a hingy or low bar back squat because that's how I lift the most load, fine. If I'm a sprinter who extends, who like projects his sternum forward to sprint faster, fine. If I'm a broad jumper who does the same thing, totally fine. Right? Like these are things that we're looking at doing that are athletic movements that may require a degree of compensation or extension that may not be what people are looking for, what people want in like a movement idealist kind of world that we're living in now, but they may absolutely be necessary for somebody's sport. Right. So understanding that there are times when these things, you want to leverage those compensations to your advantage is going to be a huge thing. And we'll go over this a lot in programming when the ways that we're looking at building out programs, or the way that I look at building out programs, is based off of physics and tissue load tolerance. Right. Where if we have a hingy back squat, but we also have a hingy deadlift, I don't want to have many hingy squats in there because I want to be able to maximize performance on both. So I want a lot more of my stuff to change the moment arm to the knees instead of the hips, so that we can save more fatigue for other muscles like the spinal erectors and things like that down the line, and have a better output in the whole training block and training program. Right? These are not necessarily things that we need to even fix. Sometimes there's the strongest way that somebody's going to express a pattern.
Yeah. Well, and that's for us, like that's said principle, right? Like there's a huge misconception. And part of it is just, again, based off like even the stuff that I post, right? That extension is bad. And that's why I train so much from a flexion standpoint. But the reality of it is I'm just biased towards extension. So for me, variability is gaining more flexion. But true variability is the ability to leverage both things within the appropriate task. So if I'm doing a heavy bilateral lift, a squat, a deadlift, a bench press, I have no problem with extension there because that's creating more thoracic stability. I don't want variability when I'm trying to do max effort loading. I want a stable joint, right? Like we all know that instability takes away from force production, right? So when we have people who power lift or people who just want to do, strength-based movements, a little bit of thoracic extension is not a bad thing. It's actually a beneficial strategy, right? What I want people to do is be able to leverage that strategy efficiently, pain-free, and effectively, but then leave the gym and be able to get into more of a neutral stacked pattern that allows for better respiration and overall movement variability for things like gait mechanics, for instance, right? I want you to be able to do both, right? We're not trying to eliminate extension. We're trying to not extend when extension isn't a beneficial strategy. Those are two very different things. And social media decreases our ability to provide context within that thing. Like even today on my post, I used a lot of constraints that allow for retracted rib cage and more scapular protraction and retraction. And somebody commented like, why are you training in lordotic posture with a posterior pelvic tilt? Well, this is one fucking training day that I'm focusing on variability. If you look at my Hatfield squats on Monday, you will see both anterior and posterior pelvic tilt as I go through the entire propulsion arc, right? You watch me deadlift, you're going to see some extension.
I'll be right back in 30 seconds.
Yeah, go take care of business, right? So we want people to be able to leverage both of these things when they're appropriate. But if you're training if you're like, we train a lot of power lifters, for instance, and they're an easy group to kind of use as an example for this, because extension is the strategy that's going to allow them to, again, maximize their power output, right? So when we think about extension versus flexion patterns, extension is going to be a more anaerobic pattern that allows for more muscular integration, right? Think about what we're doing during thoracic extension. We're getting concentric orientation of the large back muscles, which means we're getting short and tight, right? So we've got mid and lower traps, and we've got lats that are going into a more shortened, tighter, more stable position. And that does compress the rib cage and limit our ability to breathe, right? And expand during breathing. but we're also doing most extended patterns in a very short time duration activity, right? Like if you're doing a max effort squat, bench, deadlift, or even a 100-meter run, respiration doesn't fucking matter. Our output is not dependent on oxygen utility, right? So it's more dependent on muscular integration and driving more power. So that extension-based pattern is beneficial, right? And that's a prioritized pattern within those sports. And that's why you see so many of those athletes self-organize into those patterns, right? What we want to see is then those athletes be able to leverage those things, but then when they're not on a platform, be able to walk off of it and get into a more neutral pattern that allows for more overall movement variability, better gait mechanics, more efficient gait mechanics, and better respiration. So again, there's no good or bad. There's only appropriateness, right? Flexion, extension, everything in between, it's all on a continuum. We want you to be able to leverage the position that your body can best utilize to perform any given task, right? And as soon as you enter specificity into it, we're going to have a position that's more specific. What do fatigued athletes do? They put their hands on their knees and they go into thoracic flexion for more posterior expansion and the ability to take in more air, right? Your body naturally does that. It self-organizes into that. That's the opposite extreme of an extension-based pattern. It's a flexion-based pattern that allows for, again, posterior expansion of the posterior mediastinum, right, of the lungs. Most of us just do, I had to throw out a big word so people would like give me street cred.
I saw you sigh and get a little tired after saying that too.
I know. I didn't know whether to say dorsal rostral or posterior expansion. There's so much jargon that we could.
So many made up terms.
So many made up terms. So when we're talking about these things, again, most people are saying these things are good or these things are bad without providing any context of the activity or the task they're being used to perform, which again shows a complete lack of critical thinking. So we can talk about mismatches, right? That might not be great. That might be the person who's super extended, just walking around, that's not able to respire very well and not able to walk very well. And we can talk about the person who goes into a complete humpback when they're trying to do a max effort deadlift. Those might be mismatches to an extent, but there's no good or bad from an absolutist perspective. And that's what we have to start thinking about.
Derek actually just brought up something really, really good in the chat and said, I think it might make more sense to look at variability as a way to round out some of the patterning created through specificity. Yeah. That's exactly what we're trying to say.
And that's all we do with our accessory work. Yep. That's what my today's session was.
Yep.
Like I do specificity-based things on Mondays and Fridays, and I basically train the opposite pattern a little bit in the opposite ranges of motion on Wednesdays at a higher volume, right? That's all accessory work is at that point. And again, it's still specific to the task and the fact that you're trying to fill in gaps.
Right. So like, for example, like one of the things that we see with Kyle is that Kyle typically has a little bit more like lengthened relationship with his hamstrings. So his hamstrings like exist in a little bit more lengthened state, and he's more biased towards that. So we're looking at doing things on Wednesdays that are going to start training the shortened position of hamstrings, right? Like the banded RDL that he did this morning puts peak effort at max hip extension, right? So if we're looking at that, we're getting a posterior tilt of the pelvis, and we're getting hamstrings that are actually going to maximally contract from origin to insertion, and glutes that are going to anteriorly translate the pelvis. So we're still actually training a hip hinge, but we're just training the other end of the hip hinge as opposed to the lowering and the eccentric portion of it like a normal deadlift would because of the force vector. Right? Like a normal trap bar deadlift, gravity is just going from down to up. So there's no horizontal force vector whatsoever. So we're not actually looking at training hip extension or like posterior tilt of the pelvis because there's no load in those positions. So what we're looking at doing with things like the banded deadlift is we change the force vector enough to provide enough stimulus to train a more shortened position of a hamstring.
And Mike, for your question in the chat about resting hands on thighs bent over is a better respiration strategy, 100%.
Yeah.
The whole hands over your head thing is absolute bullshit. It compresses your rib cage and actually decreases your ability to take in oxygen, right? Through scapular retraction. As soon as you lock your scaps into retraction, you compress your rib cage. And we're going to talk a lot about this in the biomechanics, but your rib cage moves when you breathe, right? It expands and it compresses to allow for air coming in, air going out, and then diaphragmic ascension and descension.
There's a reason why humans just default into that pattern.
Yeah, it's like, watch what people self-organize into. It's probably the right shit. As soon as we coach people out of that, we probably fucked up, is what it typically comes down to. I honestly think coaches that have been, training kids and athletes to keep their hands over their heads, it's more because it's a stronger looking symbol than somebody who's leaning over and trying to breathe with their hands on their knees. Like, I think it's more of the image of the thing rather than the actual science behind why you're doing the thing in a lot of cases. But when you take an inhale, right? Like, we're not trying to inhale with an anterior lift of the rib cage. We're trying to inhale through posterior expansion of the rib cage. Typically, as soon as your rib cage elevates, you're going to lose the ability to fully, again, descend your diaphragm, because you've now compensated through the ISA and the sternal head, right?
The stronger position goes into the same thing that if you watch a lot of like top MMA fighters do when they're in training. After a round, they lift their hand up right away afterwards, like they've just won, right? It's a stronger, more confident looking position that can have some psychological benefits for your team over the other team.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what Jay said, is head down, hands down, knees looks like defeat.
But it's actually recovery.
And it's one of those things where, like, that's an interesting point to bring up, is because what's worth more to you, the recovery of an athlete and the recovery in between rounds or sets or whatever it is, or the potential psychological benefit that it might have for your team and the psychological warfare that it's going to put on your opponent's team. So, like, that's another really good thing to be looking at, is like, what exactly, it's just what's going to have the bigger magnitude and like the larger order of magnitude as an effect at that particular person and that particular moment in time, right? Like, if you're like Kyle talked about, like, I've experience in mixed martial arts. When I was like fighting, like, we were never allowed to put our hands down, because if I saw somebody put their hands down on their knees to recover between rounds, and I'm standing there trying to breathe, like trying as hard as I possibly can to breathe through my nose, even though I'm like dying and winded as hell, and stand normal and tall, that person sees me and they're like, oh, they're not even breaking a sweat and they're not even working hard. I now have a psychological advantage over them in the next round. Same thing with any like field sport athletes or anything like that, is like, there may be something that's said for the psychological benefit of it that brings a little bit more that takes a little bit of an edge away from the opposing team. But it depends entirely on what you're looking for in that particular moment in time. Do you need more recovery, or do you need more like a mental boost?
So super individualized, but if we're just talking pure respiration, hands above head isn't it.
Not at all.
You're going to decrease your ability.
Yeah. That was a little tangent that I just wanted to go off on.
No, it was a good one though. Like, I think it's definitely applicable.
Like, that's one of the things that we've got to look at with all of this stuff, is like, there's definitely like psychological benefits and psychological edges that you can have to being able to maximally leverage patterns that may be compensatory in nature, right? Like, if you have to compensate into extension to like crush and win something, like, that's, you know what, that's fine, because like, it's going to be a better thing. It might end up being a better thing for you to do, because it might show the other person that you're like, well, I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to win.
Yeah. And I mean, Damien, that's a perfect example of specificity.
Yeah.
But again, are bodybuilders breathing when they're posing? Not usually.
Yeah.
Like, again, respiration doesn't matter.
That is a truly anaerobic activity.
It's another activity where respiration just doesn't matter, right? They're looking at a completely different goal, which is maximal muscle recruitment, right? So when you start talking about muscular recruitment and respiration, again, like, the specificity of that thing is going to be a continuum. And the more you're trying to leverage muscle recruitment, the less ability to breathe and the less need for oxygen you're probably going to be under. The more you're trying to, again, leverage respiration, the less muscular tonicity you're probably looking for, right? Because you want a flexible structure that allows for full respiratory cycles. You don't want to be rigid, right? That's why most breathing practices are kind of built around mobility and flexibility, like yoga, Tai Chi, things of that nature, and not powerlifting or bodybuilding, right? So, Matt, you make fun of me for being slow on these, but you've spent 40 minutes on one slide, so I'm going to go ahead and just go to the next one. So
that's very fair.
That is
I deserve that one.
Matt's eye came into full effect.
I deserve that one 100%. So what we do, and like, how do we make this more efficient so we can scale it and do it as easily as possible?
Really quick, Damien, that's because exhalation is abdominals.
Yes.
I'm talking about inhalation with respiration. Like exhalation is 100%. Like your exhalatory muscles are your internal obliques, and not so much your rectus, but your oblique complex is actually what forces air up and out and controls the rib cage and the diaphragm. So that's why. Exhalation is not respiration. Inhalation is. Sorry about that.
When we're looking at building out efficient assessments and scaling these as well as we possibly can, what we want to figure out what we can do is how we can maximize the amount of time that we're spending with a person on things that actually matter. So things like their goals and other things, and things like just conversations and learning how to actually communicate with the person who's sitting in front of you. So for example, what we do with remote clients, like what I have set up through my Calendly link, and Sam has set up through his Calendly link, is we have our intake and everything all set up through there, and then automatic emails that are sent out with YouTube links that show people the assessment that I need them to film for me. They are now responsible to film and send that back to me before the consultation. If I do not receive their assessment before the consultation, we do not do the assessment and we push it off until they get it done. This is one of the first things that I do that's a non-negotiable for these people, because I want to make sure that we're not wasting anybody's time. And if they ask me to do an assessment on screen, we only have 30 minutes and that's going to take the entire time, and I don't want to do that. Right? So I filmed a video beforehand, which is another good thing that we can use as a pre-qualifier for remote clients. Right? Because again, if we're looking at vertical versus horizontal growth in a business, remote training and online training is more of a horizontal growth model where you're looking at volume because the price point is so much lower, right? So because the price point is so much lower, I want as many qualifiers as I possibly can to weed out anybody that isn't serious. I cannot tell you how many consultations I've had booked through my Calendly link on my Instagram bio that have gotten canceled as soon as the automated email sends out. And they see like, oh, I have to film this like 5-minute assessment for this guy. I'm not doing that. And they cancel it right away. It's like, okay, cool. I now know that you are going to be wasting my time. So I don't want to talk to you. I will post my assessments to the Slack channel, Faye, so everybody can see what we do.
Yeah. And we'll talk about how we do that as well.
Yeah.
Just through the consultation process.
Yeah. When it's in person, this is where, because my price point is higher, this is where we have more touch points on everything that we're doing. So all of my assessments, I get to do in person, right? And one of the differences that we do with everything that's going to be remote is because they are filming things for me. Sorry, my dogs are going to bark. Hey. So because they're filming things for me, I need to limit as much as I can with the movement assessments and make sure that they are things that are actually going to be passive in nature versus things that end up becoming active, right? So I'm not going to necessarily look at hip internal and external rotation because I cannot assess that one very well remotely because somebody has to manipulate themselves into position. So that becomes more of an active assessment for that particular person. So what we look at with this is we look at infrasternal angle, we look at shoulder internal and external rotation, we look at hip extension, we look at the toe touch test, we look at push-ups and air squats for the body weight assessments. And then all of the other movement assessments that we're going to do are going to be related to that person's goal. And again, like because this one just sends out in advance, I get that before anything else is done. And then afterwards is when I ask them for the rest of their assessments.
Yeah. Really quick, Matt, do you even go through with the consultation if somebody has not sent you the videos in the
Nope.
interview form ahead of time?
Again, I will reiterate that one more time. If somebody has not sent me the videos beforehand, I reach out to them 12 hours in advance and say that we will be rescheduling this consultation because I do not have your assessment videos.
And you're not serious enough.
Right.
That's not, and maybe that's not what you say specifically, but that's what we're saying.
That's what Kyle says.
That's what I say.
That's why Kyle had me take over the remote training.
Everybody just hates me.
I just like, wow, he's a lot meaner than he is on Instagram.
I just yell at people.
Yeah.
It's funny because Matt's the mean person on Instagram, but I'm the mean person in real life.
That's very true.
That's what is funny about our business.
So when we're doing these and when we're looking at the stuff that we're looking at doing, we want to make sure that the assessments that you choose are not arbitrary in nature, because if they're arbitrary in nature, there is absolutely no need to do them because it has no impact on somebody's programming or the lifestyle prescriptions that you're looking at from a client, right? What we can look at with this, and the reason why we pair the assessment week up with OKRs is because the assessment process is the OKRs for your clients. Their objective is the goal. The goal is their objective. The key results are going to be what you're going to do to help them achieve that particular goal. And the strategies are how you're going to implement everything else, right? So it's like, let's say we've got somebody who wants to lose like 100 pounds. One of the key results might be 30 pounds of weight loss. One of them might be a reduction in blood pressure. Another one of them might be an increased VO2 max or a better job on their 10-minute assault bike test, right? The strategies are what you guys are going to do to achieve those particular key results, right? So this is how we break it down for all of our clients is we pretty much make an OKR sheet for all of them because their goal is the objective. The key results are your plan to get there, and the indicators that are going to say that you're moving towards that goal, and the strategies are what you're doing programming wise to get them to that point. And again, if that's not directly related to the assessments that you're pulling in and you're doing with these people, it's probably a useless assessment that you don't necessarily need to do. Right? Like, for example, like if Kyle is coming in, like Kyle's programming right now is more geared towards running and volume, right? So we're not gearing up for heavy ones. We're not gearing up for singles. It's not a strength and power program at all right now. So if I was to assess Kyle and ask him to send me a 1 rep max trap bar deadlift and then never program out another 1 rep max trap bar deadlift, it's like, okay, well, that's a waste of time. What I would rather do is I'd rather have him do something like an 8 rep max set of deadlifts, because then based off of the RPE that he's given me, I can pretty like accurately calculate out a 1 rep max to set percentages. But I also want to see his work capacity. So I need to see how he's going to do over a moderately difficult set that's going to take a little bit more time. Same thing where if we're doing like a run or anything like that, I'm going to ask him for like a timed mile and then like a max distance 20-minute run, right? Where those are going to be things that we're going to look at doing that are going to really assess the exact goals that he has of more capacity and more volume and hypertrophy for strength training and a better cardiac output for everything else that we're doing fitness wise and cardio wise, right? We need to make sure that they're all meaningful with everything that you're going to do. And they should be assessed relatively regularly so that you can see if you're actually making progress towards the goal or not. Because again, if they're not, it doesn't matter. The goal didn't matter to begin with.
Also, my work capacity in no way represents my 1 rep max.
Very true. Very true. Kyle will grind out a set of like 14 at 95% of his max and then fail a single, like at like 5 pounds heavier. It's very funny.
It's pretty awful.
That's why I built AMRAP the way that I built it, is because I wanted to give him the volume to be able to start putting up heavier 1 rep maxes. But then it was really funny because we got to like the 90, 92, 95% weeks. And it was like 13, 12, 8, 0. I was like, wow, okay. That's quite a drop off there. It doesn't make any sense.
You guys need to understand that in week 1 of AMRAP, for those of you that are doing it, I did 385 on a trap bar for 37 consecutive reps after 3 sets of 15.
Yeah.
Like that's what I'm talking about with work capacity.
Yeah.
Like that was my 65% or whatever.
Yeah. And then I think you did 440 for like 17. And then, or like, no, it was like you did 520 for like 9. And then you failed 550 for 1. Like the following week. It was like, all right, well.
So dumb.
That doesn't make any sense.
So dumb.
I always got to bring this one up. My favorite text that I ever received from Kyle was he came back from a trip from New York one time, and he was doing that was in the sets of 6 week, and he goes, 520 felt like shit, didn't go very well, going for 585, and I'm like, why?
This is a perfect example of trainers not always being super smart. Despite the fact that we are.
My coach calls me a dumb smart guy all the time because I'm a smart person that makes really dumb decisions.
Yes, this is what we do. Cool. So that we actually.
This is why I went 40 minutes on that one slide, Kyle. I knew how many.
We only had 3 slides left. So actually, I just saw. I'm going to stop the share here, and then take the exit out of this because we actually have quite a few questions.
We do.
And also Chance just asked a question as well on the Slack, I believe. Yeah, so we're gonna talk about that first, I think, just because it's a super easy answer. But could you guys please talk about the best way to assess hip extension, Thomas test, or horizontal abduction, which would be like an Ober's test for all of you that like the names. I really want to use. Are we
talking shoulder? Or are we talking hip for horizontal abduction?
Hip. I'm assuming. Okay. I really want to use the best assessment possible for clients. I find that I've been stuck in using what I learned in the past from corporate gyms by looking at certain movements like air squats, push-ups, core, et cetera. So my quick answer to that is if you're in person with somebody, I would use an Ober's because you're going to be able to control for femoral rotation, right? So if somebody has limited external rotation on the femur, they're not going to be able to access full extension. And they will, again, that's where you see people go into abduction when they're in a Thomas test. You see the knee go out to facilitate more extension, right? That's a cheat. You're bypassing the hip flexor at that point to make up for it. So when we start looking at like an Ober's test, you can control the actual rotation and abduction of what the femur is doing so that you can measure full extension, right? And that's also where, and this is actually a Zach Couples thing. Like for those of you that have the opportunity or are looking for a really good seminar, Human Matrix is fantastic. Matt and I have both done it. He does once travel opens back up, like I think 1 or 2 in the New York, New Jersey area a year.
He's going to be at Pasquale's gym sometime next year. So
exactly,
Pasquale's here.
You guys can go hang out with Pasquale.
That's a terrible idea. Go for Zach, not for him.
Go for Zach, not for him.
Yeah, it's a terrible idea.
But he does a really good job of explaining also, like you also want to essentially hold where that TFL is, because as soon as the femur starts moving forward, that's full hip extension. Because again, when you start looking at passive ranges of motion, you have to understand that you're going to get a compensation. Like that's very similar to somebody doing like an internal rotation of the humerus and like the shoulder, right? You get humeral glide and the shoulder elevates. You want to stop that, right? Because that's not a true humeral range of motion. You're now looking at scapular range of motion as well. So when you start looking at the hip, if you're doing the actual, hold on, somebody's coming in here. If you're looking at measuring hip extension, you want to make sure they're not just manipulating a pelvis and going into more of an anterior tilt to facilitate more extension, right? Because those two things are going to try to travel together. They're going to leverage basically lumbar extension to gain more hip extension if they're lacking in hip extension. And that's a good way to be able to kind of measure it. When you're doing a remote assessment, Matt and I typically have people do a Thomas test. We just give them the best instructions possible.
Yeah.
Right. Because we can't facilitate the Ober's. Now, the caveat that I just want to make super clear to everybody, I can see about half you all's pictures.
Best caveat there is.
I think I've measured this before. Raise your hand if you have full hip extension. Cool. 0 hands. Raise your hand if you still squat and deadlift and lunge and run and do all the fun stuff. Who here has had a hip explode?
Has anybody died?
Nobody's died. Nobody. We're all still here. Awesome. Right. So again, these things are worth knowing, but
that's it.
Yeah, if there's no pain associated, please do not let it limit somebody's ability to get more fit.
Yeah.
Or stronger. Right? Because again, like I've been the coach who was like the corrective guy who put everybody on the floor for sometimes years, right? So that they could get full hip extension and all this shit. And they just got more and more detrained and less motivated to actually train when I could have just been setting up better exercise selections. Matt deadlifts 700 pounds and has
I got laughed at the Human Matrix for how bad my hip extension
terrible
was.
Hip extension.
Like literally laughed at. Like Zach assessed my hip extension and went, oh my God, that's terrible.
That like Matt's on record for being the worst of all the Human Matrix attendees.
For a lot of things, for many things. And I was the strongest person there by a large margin.
And he's not ever in pain and lifts a lot of weight and does okay, right? Like, again, like the biggest thing that I think everybody needs to understand is you don't need full range of motion to be a functional human being. Most of us don't actually use full range of motion for anything in our daily lives, right? Whether it's axial or appendicular, right? Full range of motion comes into play in extreme specificity typically. Most of us do not ever hit extreme specificity. And I think that's where, like, for me, that's been a big change in just my thought process over the last 3 or 4 years, is looking at, okay, like there's full range of motion, and then there's the actual range of motion that is needed for the task that I'm trying to complete, right? Which one's going to be more important to me? The one that's actually contextually appropriate. Like, that's what I need to hit. And there's a lot of cases where getting stronger is also going to help people improve their range of motion, because again, range of motion, when we look at passive and active, is largely sensorimotor as well. And sometimes you have hypertonicity simply because you're not able to stabilize a joint very well, right? So we have to think about why we have hypertonicity, why we might not be getting that full hip extension. Is it simply because our rib cage is out over our toes and we have an anterior pelvic tilt because of that? We've eccentrically orientated our hamstrings and glutes, and now we have concentric orientation of hip flexors because it's literally the only thing left to hold on? Well, what if I just reposition a rib cage? Does that solve everything? Or do I need to spend 2 hours a day foam rolling and stretching and try to get a Golgi tendon reflex?
I'm sitting on a stability ball right now just to work on my mobility.
Matt does this all day, right? So again, like, think about the whys behind the things, and think about the whys behind the interventions that you're actually using, because you might not need full hip extension to accomplish a goal, right? And if somebody has, like, especially in the gen pop world, right? But even in the performance world, if somebody has a lot of weight to lose, or if somebody's trying to get stronger, somebody's trying to overcome, injury rehabilitation, or if somebody's trying to, again, have specificity within their sport, we make this assumption that full range of motion is absolutely necessary for those things to happen, when most of the times they are not.
It's not.
And we end up wasting a lot of time not increasing or progressing somebody towards their goals to hit this very arbitrary measure of movement that they're never actually going to use.
And one other thing that I would always do is I would always challenge you as a coach and as a trainer to find exercises that will facilitate that provide an actual training stimulus over another ground-based intervention that may not necessarily do anything for that person.
Yeah.
Right. And this is one of those things that we talk about when we talk about programming and periodization all the time, is if we're looking at sensory motor exercises, if you have a person who is capable of walking upstairs, doing a 90-90 hemi bridge probably does nothing other than create a cognitive reference point for them to then learn later and then use later on. Whereas, like, doing a seated leg curl with the exact same cues and a pause, which is the exact same position, would facilitate the exact same exercises in a much better way, because you're actually training something and creating actual, like, tension in tissue that'll have a better outcome with that person. So this is one of those things where I would every single time ask if we're doing something, if somebody has compensations, what are you doing from a fitness perspective that will provide a better outcome for that person than just adding more stuff to their warm-ups every single time.
Also, Damien, Ron doesn't lift.
He's taking his 27-minute mile all the way over to Kyle's house right now to go punch him.
Ron, like if you've met Ron or been in his, like he tells people he doesn't train. Like he does not weight train. Like, again, we're talking about two very different things. Exactly. I haven't pronated my left foot in like 27 years. My calf is on point right now. So again, like when we start talking about these things, like context matters, goal selection matters, all these things matter. But what's really important to understand is, like, when we talk about corrective exercise, when we talk about movement preparation, we're trying to restore things that should happen naturally within normal human self-organization.
Yeah.
These aren't special fucking things. Like, they should just happen. And a lot of the people that we train, especially people with really low training age or really high training specificity, opposite ends of the continuum, have picked up strategies based on those things, and changes in their overall training will probably create and produce a lot of the adaptations that you're actually looking for without a ton of prep stuff.
Yeah. For example, like one of the guys that I work with has a 900-pound deadlift. Like literally has a 900-pound deadlift. And I've had to yell at him multiple times because he's doing like single leg kettlebell RDLs with like a 12-kilo kettlebell. And I'm like, you deadlift 900 pounds. If you don't put this kettlebell down, I'm going to fly out there and beat your ass. Like, pick up a heavier weight. You need to do something harder.
What people don't understand is, like, Matt's kettlebell post wasn't actually even trolling who everybody thought it was. It was trolling one of our clients who has a 2,200 pound total.
And was literally doing like, so like it was actually perfect timing because he tagged me in videos about it. And another one of my new guys had also tagged me in videos of arm bars. And then I was like, I got a little 140-pound USAPL female lifter who's doing a kettlebell arm bar with a 53-pound kettlebell. And then my 400-pound benching, like guys who bench between 400 and 500 pounds are doing them with 12s. And I'm like, she's half your size. She's doing twice your weight. And she just had her shoulder rebuilt 6 months ago. Yeah. And this is the one that we're doing it on. He's like, well, I tore my pec. I'm like, I don't care. She had her shoulder literally taken out and rebuilt. That is a worse injury than a pec tear. Like, be better. Come on, please.
All right.
That was enough ranting.
Yeah, it was. I'm going to move
into lift weights, people.
The call question. Getting strong. I mean, again, it's just like, it always circles back. Like, getting stronger solves a lot of problems for a lot of people. Like, that's just what it really comes down to. And again, the caveat there is don't train stupid.
Pick better exercises.
Yeah, pick better exercises.
Which we'll cover soon.
You guys will have that beat over your heads.
Yes.
First question here. Hey guys, question regarding education. I am new to a lead position at my gym and I am in charge of staff development. Any ideas on where to start? Our staff is fresh off of bachelor's in kinesiology with only commercial gym knowledge. Also, any advice on creating team atmosphere and team culture training? Thank you. Education is going to be super individualized. I would look at, again, not necessarily creating training, like a universal training program for your people, but at least identifying what your gym's training principles are, right? You can use this program to kind of identify those things. Because that ensures at least disregarding, or irrelevancy towards everybody's individual educational choices, that they're at least thinking about the same principles and the same outcomes, or just maybe taking different routes there. Because when you have a staff, you do want people, like, you want variability within that staff from a methods standpoint, but not necessarily from a principles standpoint, right? Because you're going to have different clients come in who have different preferences. And if everybody trains the exact same way, well, now there's no choice, right? So you're going to end up losing a lot of people from that perspective. As far as team atmosphere and culture, fucking train together.
Yeah. Nothing is better than that.
Train together, train each other. Has anybody read Sebastian Junger's book Tribes or Tribe? Right? Like humans bond over bouts of extreme stress, right? And that can be war, like in his case, but that can also be just working really hard in a training environment together. That creates bonding, right? From a literally a neurological perspective. And when you start training together, you start getting a better idea of who people are, right? It's hard to hide shit under extreme effort. Your true colors will come out. People will start understanding who you are and what you're about at that point.
I had 8 trainers in my old gym go through mass 1 with me at the same time.
Yeah, you guys are all going to cry together, real tears. It's going to be great.
We went from 8 to 1.
The funny story is, like, Pat wouldn't even be my friend, and I was his boss until I did mass with him. And it's a real thing. Like, that's where I earned his respect. We fucking trained hard together. But train one another, have people train other trainers. A lot of the gyms that I've managed in the past, trainers trained other trainers routinely because coaches need coaches. Why not get the people that are in the same room as you? Build relationships, work out together, do lunches together, do weekend shit together outside of the gym if you want to. But I would start with training for sure.
One of my old managers actually used to do something really, really good for career development, for culture development, which was whenever we'd have like meetings, if they didn't have a topic to talk about, we'd just play dodgeball. Super fun. Everybody got along really well. It was great. It was so much fun. Like he would randomly like select teams, and then everybody would just hit each other in the face with dodgeballs. It was great.
We played spike ball.
Yeah,
a lot.
It builds a lot of relationships.
Yeah. Do something where you can compete against one another and laugh a little bit and work together.
And it does absolutely. Damien just brought up a good point. It helps helps get clients when they see the unity with everybody.
100%.
100% does. It absolutely does.
In terms of assessment, I work for a corporate gym where we use a specific assessment. That's
not throwing any shade.
That was very diplomatic of you because I know where you work. I appreciate that. Would you add in some of your own assessments along with this, or would you do more assessments during the complimentary session as part of the warm-up, movement prep, movement patterning? Yeah, I mean, if you have specific paperwork where you have to fill out a form that tells scores on an assessment, do it, right? I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble with their bosses or their gyms. Just understand the limitations of what that is and what you're actually going to do with it. I think at the end of the day, we also just need to think about, based on the person in front of us, what's actually important, right? So I'm going to use a different assessment, but like for years, and this is going to date me, you guys need to know that I'm almost 38, so I'm super old. But I used to teach the overhead squat for the OPT model in a corporate facility. And everybody fucking fails the overhead squat, guys. Nobody can do it without thoracic flexion or thoracic extension. Like 1% of the population can do it. And it's usually the population that is literally not strong at all and has no muscle tissue. And they're just hypermobile. And that's great. It tells you a lot of stuff. Like I can look at overhead squat assessment and be like, oh, your lats are short. Oh, your hip flexors are short. Cool, calves, whatever. But at the end of the day, none of my clients had overhead squats in their program. You know what they could do really well? They could do goblet squats. Some of them could even do really good barbell back squats. Most of them could do front squats with really good squat form, quote unquote. So what did that overhead squat assessment actually tell me? Not a damn thing would be the answer to that.
I've had Olympic lifters who have like 100+ kilo snatches fail overhead squats. And it's like, oh, you shouldn't even be able to do that, huh?
Oh yeah. Because the proprioception of the actual bar and the weight helps you get into a better position underneath it. Cool. So a dowel doesn't actually even represent load.
Sweet.
Awesome to know. Awesome to know. So do what you have to do. But then actually, take into account what that person's goals are and, again, find out what they can do. The last few years that I was actually training people in person, I didn't do an assessment at all. I literally just started watching them move during exercise selections. I picked out exercise selections that were super conservative and just adjusted. I'd give them a kettlebell, moderate weight, and say, cool. So I'm going to have you squat this, go to a depth that you're comfortable with. I'd look at it and be like, oh, okay, we can go a little heavier, or we need a heel constraint, or we need something else, right? Maybe a different variation. And I'd go and we'd just start working out. Like every single one of you can watch an exercise and pick out a compensation. You can watch people walk down the street and be like, oh, left hip hike. They have a hard time going into swing phase. They're not getting toe push off. They're not getting pronation on that leg. Oh, we got a scapula that's winging. We all know exercises that'll correct against those things. I don't need a Excel sheet to tell me which ones to pick, right? You can watch somebody do a goblet squat, see what's happening, and adjust for it. You're all good enough trainers to do that, right? So again, just understand like what we're looking at, what we're looking for. One of the things that Matt and I always tell people is all of these assessments are made up things. Somebody made them all up, right? And they become popular and they're standardized, and that's cool, but they're all made up. They're all a collection of movements. That's all they are. It's data, it's information. What you do with it is what the training actually is, right? So make sure that the data that you're collecting actually matters towards what you're doing.
And again, if you are forced to do one of those assessments because of workplace constraints, it's kind of like we talked about in the assessments tab itself. If you know what you're looking for, you can see how people are going to move and how they're going to compensate during those exercises. So you can still kind of assess the same sort of thing that you're looking for through those specific movement patterns, and it just may be a little harder. Mm-hmm. But that'll make you a better critical thinker and give you a more critical eye, which will probably be a good thing.
Probably a good thing. Regarding goal setting and assessment, I have a couple clients who seem to have goal ADD. A couple weeks into a program or a block, they want to focus on something else, fat loss to running a 5K to muscle building to back again. Is it worth having a conversation to try to set more concrete goals, or just go with the flow and keep them happy, interested, feeling listened to? So I think understanding that person a little better is definitely good. That person from a disc perspective, I'm not sure if this person's on the call. They're probably more in like that I categorization somehow, like if that's what we're thinking about. So again, that's a person who needs structure, but doesn't do a good job of creating structure themselves, and tends to run more on like an instant gratification or shiny object syndrome based thing. They're probably going to need quite a bit of variability in their actual programming. My big question with that is, again, does fat loss, running a 5K, and muscle building have to be a different, do they have to be a different program?
Yeah.
Right. Unless we're talking about extreme muscle building and they're trying to like get a pro card, right? Or they're trying to run like a 16-minute 5K, like, do those things even have to be a different program? Because that sounds like a very variability based program to me anyway, right? I can work on work and aerobic capacity with a little bit of hypertrophy work and increasing metabolic rate at the same time. Like all of those things can happen within one programming, especially because the weight loss component is going to be largely lifestyle based. Right? Like, so I can work on all those goals fairly simultaneously at that point. Like it's all capacity driven, right? None of those are power outputs. And we're going to talk about categorization of phases and consolidation of stressors over the next few weeks when Matt gets deep into actual programming and periodization. But one of the big things that we're looking at is, does the program change that much, right? Because sometimes people just need to talk. Sometimes they need to motivate themselves with new goals. That's cool. Like that might be a person where I'm like, that sounds awesome. So today we're going to do this. High five. Cool. Right. And I'm going to give them positive reinforcement, because I never want to negatively reinforce anything that has to do with fitness for a client, unless it's like potentially dangerous, unless they're talking about like things that are detrimental to their health.
Hey, I saw this guy bench 500 pounds on YouTube. Can I go do that today?
Or like, yeah, or like even just like disordered eating or something of that nature.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of things where that could categorize. But if somebody's talking about like legitimate goals, like I'm going to encourage them. It might not change their programming whatsoever. Like if they want to run a 5K, I'm going to say, cool, like let's sign you up for a race and we'll get into like running training. Like we'll start actually figuring out what you're doing on your off days.
Yeah.
My
answer has,
well, maybe not. You know,
my answer to that has always kind of changed to like sign up for it, send me the receipt, and then we'll start training for it.
It's not a bad idea either, right? So
they're like, oh,
yeah. So I think again, there's some context there probably, but you also might find that the training itself might not change that much, especially for some of those goals. What movements are you having potential remote clients video and send before their consultation? Why? So we talked about this a little bit. Matt listed off what we're having them do. To answer Faye's question, we're actually having them do the ISA live on the actual consultation. That's the only one we do live, because we'll have them like trace their sternum down to the xiphoid process, trace their ribs, and then show us what that actually looks like. And we'd be like, cool, you're wide or you're narrow. And again, doesn't change a lot of things outside of like lateral versus posterior compression or anterior posterior compression. Like we might change a little bit of the prep stuff. We might change a little bit as far as retraction versus protraction from an exercise selection standpoint. But we're just going to be using different constraints. But that's the one that we're going to have them do live. Everything else is going to be a video submitted beforehand. And again, like I can't reiterate this enough. Most of the time, 99% of the time, I know what that ISA is going to look like by watching their movement videos. Right? It's more of a checks and balances than anything else. Right? Like I see a super hingy squat. I see somebody who has very little internal rotation of a humerus. I see somebody who has a very flat thoracic spine on their toe touch. What's the ISA gonna be? Wide. Cool. Like it's more of a checks and balances than anything else. I usually don't even check it anymore. I know Matt still does a little bit, but it's not one we actually like. It's more of just okay, this confirms the other things that I saw type of thing from that standpoint on.
Most of what I do with my people is just through the passive ones that I have them film in, and then the actual loaded ones that they send me afterwards.
Yeah.
And most of the time I just look at the loaded ones because I can be pretty sure what's going to happen in the passive ones with that.
Yeah. And that's also, again, that's our population. You might find that the passive ones are more important for your population. Like we work with a bunch of strength sport athletes and power lifters. Like the loaded lifts matter a lot.
I have one general client, one.
And she sends Matt too many videos. What has been your
separate emails for each one?
Yeah, what has been your most effective marketing strategy for remote coaching, and how often do you schedule it into your work week? We actually don't market our remote coaching that much as a business. We just put out a shit ton of content. If I'm looking to build that up more, like right now we get probably 3 to 4 inquiries a week.
I get like 3 to 4 a day when I'm posting something heavy or when I'm posting like high profile clients
without marketing at all. Right.
Yeah.
So we don't, that's actually one of the things we don't waste a marketing budget at all on, and don't waste a lot of stuff on. We just continuously put out content. People know we're coaches. People know we do remote coaching. And I think most trainers who kind of like have a hard time with that is, one, they're kind of stuck in that paralysis by analysis world where they don't post enough because they're too worried about what they're posting. And two, they do a lot of working out online, but they don't actually ever tell people they're trainers and that they're accepting clients. Yeah. And sometimes it's literally as easy as saying, hey, I'm a coach. I'm good at what I do. I'm accepting clients. Shoot me a DM, right? So again, I can see a lot of you. Raise your hand if people slide into your DMs at least once or twice a week to ask you fitness questions.
Every day. Right.
Quite often for most of us, every single one of those people should be directed to a consultation after about their second or third question. That's someone who wants training. Like they value your information and your feedback. And at that point, I'm like, hey, it seems like you have a lot of questions. It's probably easier for me to have a conversation with you about this over a 15-minute Zoom call. And then I just copy and paste the link into it. And that does one of two things. It either books a consultation or they get the message and quit fucking DMing me all the time.
Leave me alone. I actually, it was really funny. I had a guy that was like bugging me all the time for stuff. And he asked me, he's like, so how much do you charge for coaching? I was like $250 a month. And he just never spoke to me again. I wish I would have just done that a lot earlier, because it was a lot of time that I spent like talking to this person for nothing.
I have a Calendly event that's labeled consultation call that has $1,000 paywall on it just to send to people who ask too many questions. It's like the super troll.
Yeah. I actually had that happen to me. The first time I reached out to somebody to mentor me 3 years ago, the first person I reached out to told me that it was $450 an hour. And I was like, I'm going to go find somebody else now.
Yeah.
Bye.
So it's definitely one of those things again. And I only send that to people who take advantage or try and take advantage. Like, you guys have to understand, like, I've got people who I communicate with often that ask questions, and I'm perfectly cool with that. And then I have people that follow me and literally send me 10 videos of their squat right away and say, hey, what would you do with this? They get that link.
I usually tell those people I would pay me and then ask me again.
Have you ever encountered a client who achieved their weight loss goal and wanted to continue training, but did not have a new measurable goal in mind? What do you do at that point? Create one for them or continue to build on delivering the quality training experience? Could be either, right? Like, typically the weight loss clients that I've had, the weight loss that they experienced typically opened up more doors for more goals, right? It kind of created more opportunities that they maybe didn't think was possible, right? So I always try to frame when I'm working with somebody in that weight loss category, like, what do you want to do with your new body, right? Like, if we keep on talking about why the weight loss is important and what it's a means for, the creation of a new goal is going to come more often than not. But you might have people who, again, are really on that qualitative spectrum, that at that point, they just might want to continue training because of the relationship with you and because of an accountability perspective to stay fit. And at that point, I'm just running a very variability-based program that they enjoy doing and making sure that training remains a positive part of their life, right? And that's where I can actually create more adherence and more of an actual behavior change rather than just, oh, this is something that I do 3 times a week, right? So again, based on the client, we might need to come up with a new goal, but not always. Like, I would 100% be lying to you guys if I said that every single client I've ever trained had an empirical goal. It's just my goal to try to get them there so that I can measure progress. Sometimes I create an empirical goal for them and never even tell them what it is.
Yeah.
Right. So again, because they don't care, but I care because I'm an analytical numbers nerd. And like, as a C, that matters to me, and it makes sense.
Yeah, I've actually had that exact experience happen to me with a client of mine who had a weight loss goal. We hit that, then had a performance goal of like hitting a 5K in a certain time. We hit that by like, he beat that one by like 4 minutes. And then afterwards I was like, so what do you want to do now? And he goes, really? I just want to keep coming. And I was like, cool, let's go.
3x52 method.
That's it.
Super easy. Let's do it.
I just don't want to stop. Okay, that's fine.
Love the Eisenhower matrix, but I find myself paralyzed applying it. Would this allude to my S trait? Yes. Surfacing where I overthink and overanalyze, or does this mean I need to begin thinking of my days and weeks and start planning those better? Tips to break through this would be greatly appreciated. Both.
Yeah, I would say yes.
That would be indicative to both of those things. you are a true S, and that is cool. Like S's have a lot of good characteristics, especially relating to clients. Like that's a powerful archetype for sure. The best way for this is probably, instead of pre-planning what your days, weeks, and months should look like, I would actually start reviewing what my typical day, week, and month looks like, and then prioritizing the things that I find myself doing often, right? So if I'm looking at my habits from a daily perspective, I'm going to start analyzing what the return on those things are. And the ones that have the bigger return, I'm going to prioritize into that more important categorization. And I'm going to start doing the same thing from a weeks to months perspective. So if the planning of it is more of an issue, because that happens, like I'm a CS, so that happens for me too. Reviewing the habits that I already do might be something that's actually very powerful for me, because I can then start categorizing based off the things that I'm already comfortable with, rather than trying to implement a bunch of new shit and a bunch of novelty. Because again, if we look at the disc, the D and I's, they lie on the top of that continuum. Like novelty is great for those people. Typically, they get very motivated and encouraged by new stuff. And your C's and your S's are going to be a little more familiarity based. And they find comfort in kind of doing some of the same things and getting really good at those things over and over and over again, and the scalability of that. So play to your strengths, from that perspective, I think for sure. Matt's completely on the top there, so I'm not even going to ask his opinion on it.
What? Oh, the eyes?
Yeah, because you are
tiny object.
Yeah, that's true. Love the assessment approach of having it pertain to your goals. Any tips when you work at a Globo gym and you have less room to do your own thing? So we kind of answered this a little bit. Do the paperwork you need to do. But then if you have more specific assessments that you find are more valuable to the people that you work with, the demographic that you attract, do those things. Right? Like
I know what gym you work for, and they do provide enough performance assessments that you can do other stuff based off of a person's goal.
Yeah. Like for sure, and again, the thing about especially like Globo gyms, because you don't necessarily have to market yourself because you have a membership base. A lot of your clients end up being kind of self-selecting anyway. Like people will watch you train people on the floor, and they like the way you do things. They like the way you train, the vibe you put out, whatever. And they kind of pick you a lot more times than you're picking them occasionally. So again, like a lot of those people are going to be drawn more to your style anyway. So you might have some assessments that fit in with that categorization or that demographic that, again, once you run them through what you have to do, you'll just kind of start implementing those into their first couple training sessions. And those will be the measurables moving forward. And if those things get better, the things that you have to do will also probably get better in this case, more often than not. And I think that's kind of a good way to think about it. Again, like that's kind of more of a needs wants thing on your, if you have to turn in paperwork to a manager, do it. But that doesn't mean you can't do additional things as well. Like I've managed lots of gyms at this point, and I've never berated a coach for doing too many assessments based on who they were working with, if they made sense. Like that's different than Matt and I saying, hey, don't do all the assessments on everybody, right? Because at that point, they don't all make sense. There's no context included, and you might be measuring a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter. But if these are things that matter, I think you're probably good with that. Can you guys add a cell in the spreadsheet under revenue calculator that adds in the section for training rent? I pay $15 a client and want to see that auto calculated along with taxes to help figure out my base price. No, but what we can do is we have an Excel, again, chapter within this, and that's something that Matt can help you kind of start devising within that. That's something we can include in that chapter. And two, just add $15 to your pricing.
That sounds like a pass-through rate to me.
Yeah, like that's something that, for me, if I'm a corporate trainer, right, and I know that I get paid, $60 out of my $150 session, I know what my net is and I know what my gross is, right? So I'm going to start running like my actual business plan off $60 and not $150, because that would screw me up. Right. So if I have, in a similar fashion, if I'm working out of a private facility and I pay that facility rent, if my dollar per hour is $100, well, I'm going to start charging my clients $115 if that's the rent. Like, I'm going to adjust my pricing model based off of that. Right. I'm not going to eat $15.
Oh, hell no.
Only have an $85 net from that perspective. I'm just going to adjust my pricing model. And we deal with that a lot, especially coming from New York. Like, that's just a name of the game. There's a lot of private gyms and they all charge rent in some form or fashion. Right. So if you know that's what it is, it's very easy to just implement that into your pricing model and have it pay for itself. And I think that's something you should be doing anyway, from that perspective, for sure.
Like, another example that I have down here in Texas is I have a friend down here who also works at a private gym, and he eats all sales taxes and processing fees for like Square. And I was like, why? Why would you do that? Just factor all of that stuff in. Yeah. Like, make them pay sales taxes. You don't pay sales tax and then get business taxed on top of that. That sucks. They pay all that stuff.
Which is also what businesses do.
Yeah.
Right. You're a business.
Pass the taxes on to you.
Yeah. You're a business. A business ain't paying taxes for you. You go to Chipotle and you want to buy a burrito. Like, they're not paying your taxes for you.
Nope.
So
we're going to charge you $8 flat because you're a nice guy, Kyle.
No, we're going to eat the rest of it.
It'd be $8.37 because taxes happen.
Yeah, like you're paying that. Last question here, and we're going to cover this a lot, but it's regarding anterior compression, flexed pattern. What constraints or loading strategies would you use to tackle this? So with that, I'm going to do a lot of the opposite stuff that I do with an extension-based pattern, right? So I'm going to be looking at more scapular retraction, more humeral external rotation. I'm probably going to be lying people a little more supine to get more posterior compression as well from that perspective. And I don't care if I see a little bit of arch, right? If they've got, depending on what their pelvis is doing, I'll make some adjustments versus a more like posterior anterior pelvic tilt or a more nutated or counter nutated sacrum. But I'm going to be focusing a lot on concentric orientation of the lats and traps to help draw the scaps back and actually start getting more posterior compression of that rib cage for more lateral expansion of the rib cage. And we're going to, again, I know a lot of these words don't mean a lot to a lot of people, but this question is about a week early, and we're going to cover a lot of it in the biomechanics stuff and the respiration stuff. But for the person who asked, that's essentially what I'm looking at from that standpoint. Anything to add there, Matt, in addition? Like, here's the thing with training, guys. Regardless of what somebody's goals is, like, all we are is problem solvers. Somebody comes to us missing a certain quality, and we're there to get it for them.
Yep.
And sometimes that's aerobic capacity. Sometimes that's hip extension. Sometimes that's posterior compression of a rib cage. Sometimes that's a 400-pound bench press.
Hey, did you guys know I bench 400 pounds?
Did you guys know that Matt bench presses 400 pounds?
You guys know that?
I brought that in just for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So
it's great because my friend Matt Turner is on this, who also he's a power lifter in the same area as I am, and he squats a lot more than I do, but I get to keep rubbing it in his face that I bench 400 pounds and he doesn't. Sorry, Matt.
So as far for okay, we have a couple of things here in the chat box. The CP assessment file you guys put on the website for us to download, do you email that to the client to fill out, or do you fill it out together on the assessment call if it's a remote client?
I fill them out on the call because I'm just asking the people the questions about it. Other than that, the intake form, they fill out everything in advance. Yep. Right. And then we dig deeper into that stuff and ask more questions on that stuff. But like, I'm trying to collect biometrics and other things like that on the call with them and ask deeper questions about their particular goals.
Yeah. And that's where, like, we have people do as much stuff ahead of time as possible so that we can have a way more efficient and effective consultation. If I'm in person, I'm going to do the same thing. So because that consultation typically is a consultation, assessment, training session combination for most of you at a gym. If I send out the paperwork ahead of time and I can just review the paperwork in 10 minutes and then get people moving, I am much more likely to probably, sell, for lack of a better word, that client. If I have to sit there and fill it out with them for 40 minutes, and then we have to do, whatever that assessment is for the next, say, 10, and then they're like, so what are we doing now? And I bust them through like a 10-minute circuit of something. I have a much worse chance because I wasn't able to display what I actually do in a practical manner. I just talked with them. And the reality of it is, information is super important for you guys, but the majority of people that come into a consultation, the expectation is they're going to sweat, right? I know that might not be as important as what we want from an information perspective, but that does not mean those two things are mutually exclusive. I can send out all the paperwork ahead of time, get the information back, earmark a couple of the questions, flag a couple of the questions, and say, hey, right, like, let's talk a little bit more about this because this pertains to what we're going to do in the gym. Run them through my assessment and get them into like a 30-minute training session instead. And I've got a much better chance at that point of getting most people onto an actual program, because now they have the experience of what a training session actually is with me, rather than me just talking to them about their goals.
Ryan, are you eating pizza? Nice.
Well done. Well done.
Buffalo chicken, actually.
That's disgusting. That's not a real pizza. I expect better from a New Yorker.
You can leave.
No, I actually.
Wait, you did leave. You did leave. All right, see ya.
but I eat real pizza. Came in a few minutes late. Was just wondering how we should go about the homework for week 3. How so? What's you can unmute yourself. What's the question itself?
If he's still on the call.
He is. I see him here.
Oh, Derek's still here? Okay, cool.
Whether or not he's paying attention, I do not know.
PC with no mic.
Okay. So I mean the simple answer is just fill it out. Just fill it out. What do you mean? It's OKRs and Eisenhower matrix.
He's just wondering.
I was like, what? I need more context than that.
This is why you guys you think I'm the mean one. Kyle's the mean one. He's like, what do you mean? Just fucking do it. Like,
you guys should see Matt and I's text thread. It's terrible.
It's it's all him being mean to me.
It goes both ways.
Yes, it does.
But anyway, but again, same thing. Like you all can definitely post this week's homework on the Slack channel. You guys can send it to us if you want. Just tag us in it so we see it and we can give you some feedback. We're always open to that. We're always open to providing feedback for that. You don't have to wait until week 10 to turn us in a full document. Like, we can talk about it on the way through. But I also, like we said last time, and a lot of you did, I highly recommend posting it to the Slack, because again, like, there's a ton of great coaches in this group. They can also give you feedback. Like, use everybody, like not just Matt, Sam, and I, but everybody, because there's probably people who are actually in a more similar environment to you than us in this group, for sure. They might even give you better feedback in some cases than we do. So that's all I got. Anything to add there, Matt?
That's all I got for today.
Cool. Well, we will see everybody on the Slack channel, and then get ready for Monday's call. All right. See everybody.
Have a good weekend, guys.